Welcome back to another video where I'm exploring another theory of consciousness. And the reason why I do this is because I want to help you, me, and everybody understand at a deeper level why we are here and why we might want to engage in the world in a different way. Now, there's a lot of chaos and uncertainty brewing in the air, so it's even more important that we gain some sense of meaning and understanding of what maybe a greater picture might be of reality. The dominant worldview of our time, materialism, doesn't help us with a sense of meaning. It tells us we're biological accidents. We are a meat suit that came about through random processes. Effectively, materialism tells us that our consciousness is the next best thing to a hallucination. And then, when we die, all of the things that we thought, did, felt, cared about just disappear. The lights go out, nobody's home, poof, gone. But there's a fatal flaw in the materialist theory, and that is not that it's just spiritually very unsatisfying. So in my previous videos, I looked at the orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness, the Orch-OR theory. And this was developed together by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. And basically, Hameroff, that's what I'm going to call them as a couple. You know how you've got Brangelina? Stuart and Roger are now a Hameroff. So they looked at how consciousness might arise from this sort of synaptic feature called a microtubule, and that this provided a warm-wet interface with the quantum field of collapsing moments of consciousness. And as a constellation of all of the different moving parts within us, the orchestra of all of these parts created the symphony that is us. Okay, so this is kind of cool. Like, we've got a starting point for a scientific basis of where consciousness might coincide with us. But it doesn't really give me, as a psychologist or a philosopher, anything more. So Roger and Stuart, I'm opting out of my little intellectual polycule with you guys, and I'm hopping over into an idealistic relationship with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup and his theory of analytic idealism. So the core postulate of analytic idealism is basically that the fundamental nature of reality is not matter, but mind. So this doesn't mean that philosophically we become solipsists, that the only thing that exists is what's in my mind and that's the only thing I can be sure of. This is a far more sophisticated theory, which I quite like fundamentally and philosophically and even scientifically, because we've got the science from Penrose and Hameroff. Thanks so much, it was great. And now we've got a greater fleshed out theory, which in future videos I'm going to flesh out even further to give a more complex theory of psychology, psychotherapy, and human meaning in general. So you better hit that subscribe button if you want to hear about that. But first, let's learn as much as we can in this video about analytic idealism, championed by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. So according to Kastrup, what we see as physical reality, matter, energy, space, is actually not a thing in itself. Meaning it's not a noumena, according to Kant, if you want to speak Kantian right now. It's actually the extrinsic appearance of mental processes. And these mental processes are actually the mental processes of the universe, also known as the mind at large. So for Kastrup, the quantum field as such that Penrose and Hameroff utilized is a thing. No. Is it a thing? Hold on. It's not a thing. It's a mind. So matter isn't, let's just bore down. Matter isn't actually the generator of consciousness. Consciousness already exists. Like, in fact, everything is consciousness. But then, of course, we've got to immediately ask the question is like, well, how does everything feel solid? Like, how can I orient myself in this consciousness if it's all just consciousness. So Kastrup uses the analogy of, I'm going to use the term quantum field, but it's not quite accurate, the mind at large, the consciousness from which all is manifest, as being like a giant lake or even an ocean. And the fabric of this has ripples in it. Now, the ripples are distinct from the ocean, but they're not actually divorced. They're not separate from the ocean. But as you see, say, a wave come up and the foam of the wave crashes and dissolves back into the sea, this is essentially us. And the reason why we appear to be so much more than just a ripple on a wave is, in Kastrup's words, to exist is to have properties. And hence, the mind at large is a universal field of subjectivity. So it cannot be featureless. And it must, if it's to exist, it has to have tendency. And this is where Kastrup aligns directly with the Jungian concept of the collective unconscious. And that is that there are archetypal patternings inherent, intrinsic to the universe that are the intrinsic structure of reality itself. Now, archetypes in this theory do not exist as such, but they are, as it were, the organizational templates for the things that are, the things that be. So to narrow this down a little bit, you've got the ocean of consciousness, and this is to make it palatable to your mind. And you've got the waves and all the different aspects of the way in which their consciousness can change. But the actual wave itself and its formation and the little parts of the wave, and it would be governed by the archetype of the wave. So this means that archetypes aren't images in our head. They're not necessarily only psychological constructs. They're actually patterns, deep laws of nature. So the archetypes serve as a way in which consciousness prefers to express itself. So archetypes are the patterning of consciousness. So this means that you, me, everybody are manifestations of this consciousness. So then how, if we're all part of the same thing, how do we differentiate? How do I know I'm different from you? And how come I can't read your thoughts? This is where Kastrup uses the analogy of dissociation. And he means it literally, as in the analogy of dissociative identity disorder, once known as multiple personalities. Now, in this disorder, dissociative identity disorder, people have these different distinct personalities, which were sadly developed as a result of trauma, that have characteristics, qualities, preferences. Some of them have diabetes or blindness, while the main primary identity doesn't. So they're fragmentations of the original human's ego consciousness that have split off into identities that aren't in awareness of each other. They don't actually map up together. So the dissociated part, we're like a dissociated part of the greater consciousness. We don't know, most of us, that we are part of this greater consciousness. We think we're separate. In fact, our ego preserves a sense of separateness or identity. So in psychodynamics, this makes sense because even a personality, an ego identity, a human, has parts of self that are dissociated from the main ego identity. And this could be explained in the way that a lot of our conscious mind is actually unconscious or in the shadow, as it were. But we also often have parts of ourselves which we are only aware of when we're in them. And depending on the level of maturity of the person and the level of integration of their ego, sometimes these parts of self can operate almost as if they're out of awareness or take over the driver's seat in the sense of, like, say, someone who has an addiction doesn't want to have an addiction, but when the addictive part comes up, well, off they go to their dealer. So it's almost like we can look at this whole constellation of the universal mind and our minds and the fragmentation within our minds as like a fractal, where we are a fractal emergence of the universal mind, the greater mind. We also within our own psyche have fragmented, fractalized different subsets of self, exiles, things in the shadow, parts of ourselves that we don't want to know about. So let's ask the question, in analytic idealism, if it's all one mind, why did this one mind need to disassociate into individual units known as us, or anything at all? So we, humans, have evolved to the point where we can think about thinking. We can reflect on what we're doing. We can learn. We can have experiences and learn from them. In fact, the ego is a bundle of experiences that we have learned and experienced and learned from and map out our predictive behavior from. And so the function that we serve to the greater mind, which is relatively unmanifest in many ways, is that our metacognition can feed back information to the greater mind. Now, this theory of us learning and, as some would say, God learning about itself is a feature of many different philosophies and religious traditions. And what it means is that the consciousness, as it is only conscious, doesn't have this metacognition, this ability to reflect and this ability to be in the italics physical world, to manipulate matter, to have interactions, and to have these learning experiences. And so on a broad level, we could say that our metacognition is actually the universe, the greater mind, thinking about itself. Okay, so we have meaning already. We are these ripples in the pool of the greater field of mind consciousness that has the ability to think, learn, reflect on those learnings, and do things. So is that our only aim? I mean, we just get out in the world and make stuff happen? So what is the role and analytic idealism of us beyond the expression of the universe getting to know itself? What more could there be from that? Because we have these egos, and these egos tend to like to do a lot of things that involve collecting stuff. We compete, we war, we have all of these feelings, and we seem to have this drive to protect ourselves as an ego identity. When you think about it, most of the ego is formed through the process of conditioning, and then we spend an awful lot of time and energy through the formation of that ego, then protecting an identity which we haven't necessarily chosen. Most people want a level of success and material comfort and status and relationships and all of these things. There's also the effect of all of these other minds around us and society that says, dear ego, as you grow, you should get as much stuff, fame, importance, great relationships, and all of the things that capitalism says that you ought to want. So is that all we are here for? Is that all the universe, the greater mind, wants to manifest through us as just a collector of stuff in the material world and the learnings that we get from that? I think not. So here again, Kastrup turns towards Jung, Carl Jung, for greater meaning, as are so many of us these days. And he looks at his own midlife crisis, informed by Jung's work and many other theorists who have realized that around midlife, which could be anywhere between 35, 45, 50 is the new 42, that this crisis of meaning occurs. And so the first half of life is essentially meant to be the building of the ego identity. We are growing, we do want to reproduce, get stuff, have security, learn who we are through the work we do in the world and our relationships. But we get to a point where we've experienced that enough, and maybe we've gained enough. Maybe, you have reached the pinnacle of your career and you've found that it's really not that satisfying. It's just more hours, and you can then get a bigger mortgage and buy another car. But at a point in time for many people, this all becomes a little bit empty. And so then the purpose of life transforms slowly over time with this awareness that there must be more. And when it comes to what we might call a crisis of meaning, a midlife crisis, some people can have this crisis of meaning much earlier, and some people never get it. Their ego is structured in a way where getting more and striving for more and staying in that, ego building, identity building time of life continues. But if you are a person who finds yourself partway through life wondering that there's got to be more than this capitalism, and goodness knows it's failing a little bit, then Bernardo Kastrup and Analytic Idealism has an answer for you. So the universe, the ocean of the greater mind, the all that is, which is just phenomenal, that we cannot understand, but we can turn our energies towards tuning in to it. And this would be where we would hopefully have integrated our ego enough that it's not fragmented into dissociative parts that are wreaking havoc in our life and causing so much ruckus and basically taking so much vital energy from us that we do not get the peace and calm to have this. Alternately, people have crises that plummet them into this sense of existential, what is there? There must be more. That we can start to reintegrate our ego and therefore not have this fragmentation, so that we can loosen the disassociation with the greater mind of all, with the greater field of being, that we can then feel more connected as we are. And in Kastrup's model, this would be going with the natural flow of life. So the goal then of personal growth isn't just so that you feel better, it's so that you can align with this greater flow and this urge of the greater mind to know itself through us. And in the recognition of that, you realize that your meaning, your learning, your joy, your peace, and your ability to tune into this field and see what wants to express through you, all of these things matter. In Kastrup's word, this would be surrendering to the Daimon, the Daimon. It is kind of pronounced demon, but that gets very confusing. It's a guiding force. In Jungian terms, it would be the greater S self, the big S self. And this is the part of us that I believe is the connection with where the disassociation blurs and the boundaries between us and all that is. But because we are still operating through an ego, we need to be aware of this potential. And Kastrup calls this surrender to the Daimon, to the greater mind, the freedom of the slave. And I'll talk about the issue of free will in another video. But this is true freedom when we are expressing our natural potentials, and the natural urge from the natural self, from the greater mind as it desires to express through us, and not being driven by our little conditioned ego, which is very contracted, separate, and pretty much wants to gobble everything up for itself and get more stuff, like a hungry ghost. Speaking of ghosts, finally we arrive at the ultimate question. So then we die? So in materialism, you just die. And all of those amazing things that you experienced, all the joys, all the suffering, all of the learning, all of that, poof, goes. In Analytic Idealism, everything that you experienced doesn't. And I find this comforting. So we don't need to have this idea of our ego and our identity continuing to exist in heaven or something, because I've thought about that concept a lot, of the concept of the soul. God is the greater mind, and the greater mind is only learning about what is capable through this, I guess I'm going to call it a teleological drive, meaning a drive to evolve without an actual end goal. Because there isn't really a point having an end goal as a great universal omnipotent God, because then you kind of know what's going to happen at the end, right? So this teleological drive, this drive to express and learn and know, is how, metaphorically, God is discovering itself. And so that makes us even more meaningful, and it makes how we orchestrate our lives significant, because remember, we are all emanations, waves, whirlpools of the one great ocean. We're just so disassociated in our ego that we don't know this until maybe in the second part of our lives, we feel this urge emerging within us to understand this at a greater level. And we turn to Jung, and we turn to therapy, and we turn to the crisis of meaning. And here is an answer. You are interconnected with it all. You can develop this sense of your service to other parts of you, other aspects of the greater mind, as you surrender your ego drives. Now, you do not have to go out into the wilderness and live alone, or, just jettison out of the capitalist society. No, we need you there. We need people that know that they are part of a greater whole, that they are part of an unfolding and a learning, and that when they die, when anyone dies, the quality of that information becomes at one again with the greater mind. And so this is why feeling love, feeling the essential qualities or the archetypal Platonic forms of truth, beauty, justice, goodness are relevant, because we're then not only tuning into this universal mind at its more essential nature, but we are also, going with the flow of the mind, and we're surrendering our ego contraction to an expansion of then saying, aha, so this is what it's all about. How I feel, how I learn, how I think, what I create, what I express does matter, and it does make a difference. And it does matter even if it's not really matter. And it does make a difference at the end of our day. So where does this leave us? Well, in my mind, and in the greater mind, and in the mind of Kastrup, this leaves us with a profound responsibility. You are not a passive observer of a materialistic universe. You are the universe's way of knowing itself. Just as you are learning about yourself, the universe is learning about itself. In this, your suffering is not meaningless. Suffering is a valuable part of life, how we negotiate suffering. Your suffering is the friction that the universe needs to learn about itself, as much as your joy is also. So your joy is not an accident, it's the universe celebrating itself, and your suffering is not an accident either. It is the universe learning about the friction and the overcoming and the endurance of the human condition. And by engaging in your own ego work and potentially surrendering yourself to the flow of the natural urge of the universe through you and serving it and others, you're not just improving your life, you're evolving the mind of the universe. So thank you for listening to this video. I hope you've learned something. I hope if you've learned something, you might comment on that, like, subscribe, and stay with me when we engage at a much deeper level in the next video. Thank you. The universal mind in me salutes the universal mind in you. Namaste.